Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 25th Annual National Book Festival. We're so grateful to the Library of Congress, as well as General Motors for sponsoring the conversation today, and grateful to all of you packing the room today for the conversation and those watching on C-SPAN. I'm Ken Biberaj, the host of Coffee with Ken, and over the last few years, we've welcomed governors and CEOs and cultural leaders to our series. But few topics have felt as timely as what we're going to talk about today. Pulling the curtain back on globalization, not as an abstract or invisible concept, but through two powerful lenses: a Swedish shipping barge and your iPhone. Makes perfect sense, right? Well, it didn't make sense to me until I read both of these books, and I am thrilled to have Patrick and Ian with us to help make sense of all of it. Great to see you guys.
Thanks.
Thank you.
What's so exciting about being at these festivals is not only getting the opportunity to read these books and learn about the stories that are being told, but also having the opportunity to hear from authors about how they even concocted these ideas, what it went through to kind of find the story that they were about to tell. And it really feels like all three of us, and we chatted about this last night, kind of had our own pandemic projects. I started drinking a lot of coffee, and Ian and Patrick dove into some very serious topics. So Ian, why don't we start with you? How did you get the inspiration for Empty Vessel? And tell us a little bit about that story and your journey to create it.
Yeah, well, thanks, Ken, and thanks to all of you for being here. So as Ken was saying, the origin story of Empty Vessel is very much a pandemic project. I was living in New York, and my wife is a public defender. And she had clients who were incarcerated on what was called the boat. Now, the boat was the last remaining prison ship or jail ship in the United States. And I just became totally fascinated with the fact that in 2021, there was still a jail ship operating in the US. My background is from British imperial history, and so immediately I thought of the great prison hulks that were a staple of British imperial life in the long 19th century. And so I just dove in to learning about first the prison barge that was in New York, and then another barge that it had replaced. And this barge had a remarkable story, one that I just couldn't make up. It was built in Sweden in the 1970s in a state-owned shipyard with a lot of government subsidy. It's meant to house, it's basically a 94-meter-long steel barge with a bunch of modified shipping containers on top. And it's meant to house offshore oil workers. And then it goes to the Falklands, where it houses British soldiers. It goes to Germany, where it houses Volkswagen workers. It comes to New York, where it serves as a jail. It goes to the UK, where it's a prison. It goes to Nigeria, where it serves as an accommodation for offshore oil workers again. And along the road, along the watery road, it is involved in so many aspects of the offshore world. Offshore oil, of course, but it's also haggled over in international arbitration. It's owned by these shell companies that are registered in tax havens. It itself is registered in 6 different countries. And what I realized was this was just a remarkable vehicle for talking about the emergence of the offshore world over the past 5 decades. And the result is this book, Empty Vessel.
That's amazing. And Patrick, you're in San Francisco. You've been covering tech. How did you get to the point of not covering Apple just for the Financial Times, but deciding to actually dive into creating this book?
So I sometimes joke that the book came out of the failure to cover Apple well rather than the success of covering Apple well. What I mean by that is I think usually when a business reporter writes a book, it's sort of like you've written a bunch of hit articles and then you maybe pad it out into a book. And for me, it was really quite the opposite. I found Apple a really difficult company to cover. They are notoriously secretive. Some of my sources worked for both the military and Apple, and they would say Apple was far more secretive than the military. I don't know what that says about our national security. So there was that, but then I basically got a little embarrassed in an interview with a semiconductor maker about how little I understood about, I think I can mention the name, the Qualcomm, this chip designer. They were talking about going to TSMC in Taiwan and really sort of drilling down into how the things would get manufactured. And I thought, but you only design chips, you don't make them, so why would you be doing that? And he said, well, it's just like Apple. And I realized I didn't realize how Apple made their products. And wanting to educate myself, I thought, okay, I'll go read the best books and magazines that spell this out, and kind of slowly realized like there was nothing on that. So the book attempts to be 3 books in one. So instead of like the magazine article that's padded out, it's really like 3 books trying to really trim down. So the result is that it's really dense. And the 3 books are a company that's nearly bankrupt in 1996, and how did they become the world's most valuable company? You'd think that book had been written multiple times. It hasn't been. If you have a book in your mind right now, it's a biography. Walter Isaacson. The other book was, how does Apple actually manufacture their products? And of course, they don't manufacture them directly anymore. They orchestrate it. But this was a company founded by 2 Steves in a garage, redesigning circuit boards. I mean, they really have in their DNA manufacturing. And how they gave that up and sort of found a new role of outsourcing, and why that goes to Asia from originally the idea of outsourcing is an American idea, comes out of Alabama. That hadn't been told. And then how did they sort of tie their fate to China? And that hadn't been told either. So the book is just like 3 books in one.
Amazing. Ian, one of the threads that I saw in both books was really the role of government. And it was so insightful that you cover in your story the creation of container ships, which we see container ships, we get our products from them. But it wasn't until the 1950s that an American businessman actually created it. And what did that moment do to the global supply chain, infrastructure for ports, and shipping in general? While at the same time, what was happening in Sweden that kind of caused the vessel to kind of have this lonely, empty state of just floating around.
Right. So containers have revolutionized global trade. They, in essence, have standardized the way that goods can be moved around the world. Take a standard steel box, and suddenly loading a standard steel box onto a ship, off of a ship, onto a train, onto a truck becomes a much more seamless process. This happens in the 1950s and 1960s. It's the brainchild of a trucking executive, a US trucking executive.
From New Jersey.
From New Jersey, Malcolm McLean. And it becomes ever more important, especially after Malcolm McLean convinces the Department of Defense to use shipping container technology in Vietnam. So the barge that I am writing about is constructed really when shipping containerization is taking off in the 70s. And the logic of moving goods around the world seamlessly is transposed to housing people. You can very efficiently and cheaply manufacture an accommodation vessel by making it out of containers. And this is what's done in Sweden, thinking of the people who are working on offshore oil in the North Sea in the 70s.
So getting back to kind of the role of government, you dive into the depth of Apple's involvement in China.
Yep.
We in Washington hear it all the time. Our biggest adversary is China. We have to compete against China. Did Apple make China what it is today?
The government question is interesting because, in a sense, the role that outsourcers play is because of the absence of government. So if people go back all the way to the 1981 creation of the IBM PC, IBM decides not to build it themselves. And this is at a time when they're described by a young Steve Ballmer as the sun, the moon, the stars of the technology industry. But in an effort to really create a PC quickly, they rely on a company called Spacecraft Incorporated, this is the Alabama company, who does the circuit board and later does the entire assembly of the computer. They're sort of the first major outsourcer for the electronics industry. And when you have that relationship, essentially you're sort of transferring the technological know-how from IBM to SCI in terms of how to put it together. And then SCI would have what's called like shop floor innovation or process knowledge innovation to sort of make those investments and do things in a better way. And the rise of the PC and all the clones is really based not on the aesthetics of the computer, the user design, all the things Steve Jobs cared about. It's actually very similar to the standardization of the container ship, right? That's what gives birth to the PC as a household product. But when you're going from IBM to SCI, you're going from company to company. And once the suppliers themselves all start moving to Asia, and then in particular to China, that technological transfer is going from country to country. So I compare Apple, if I'm fast forwarding a little bit, not to someone that sort of just like holds on to the knowledge itself, but actually played the role of Prometheus, handing the gift of fire to China. Because through their vast consolidation efforts, I mean, everyone knows the iPhone's made in China, but usually we're totally unfamiliar with just how insane, because they're successful, the investments are. And of course, in China, which has become more authoritarian and belligerent since the rise of Xi Jinping in late 2012, the government in China has played a very critical role, sort of allowing Apple to do this, not allowing them to do that, banning certain things. You can't have WhatsApp, you can't have ChatGPT in China, and so forth. And so Apple's had to sort of play that game. And then in a sort of great irony, we really thought that by investing in China, allowing corporations to invest in China, they would become more like us, right? Maybe a liberal class was going to sort of rise up and maybe overthrow the communists. Instead, ironically, we're becoming a little bit more like China. We're investing in industrial policy. We're trying to compete on that level. So the absence of government has actually become more like, Tim Cook is in the Oval Office putting down a hunk of gold onto the Resolute desk to sort of, declare that we're investing in America. And we're not really, but it looks good. But we're sort of adopting a Chinese model. So irony of ironies.
Just to stay on that for just one moment as we think about talent, how many people has Apple educated, trained, and prepared for the future of work, whether it's designing, technologies, manufacturing in China versus the United States?
So the number of people that Apple has trained since 2008 is 30 million people, so greater than the labor force of California. The number of people in China alone that are building products on an annual basis in China is 3 million. I don't know the specific figure for America, but it's not many. I mean, Apple globally has 160,000 employees. I think approximately 80 to 100,000 are in America. But we're not training them the same way. And in fact, what Tim Cook told Donald Trump, I think just yesterday, certainly it's when I saw it on social media yesterday, was that education is sort of all that matters for the future. And I couldn't agree more with him. But the number of people that have been trained through vocational training, English as a second language, basic math, basically programs designed by Apple, by Foxconn, for workers to sort of undergo after their 12-hour shift in China, that number alone is around 8 million people, according to Apple. Apple, there's no such thing as like an Apple University aside from their corporate development plan, operating in America. They have a small program in Detroit, but it's certainly not educating tens of thousands, let alone hundreds of thousands, let alone millions.
Wow. So Ian, as you track the vessel and you're going overseas and you're learning more about what it means to be offshore, talk a little bit about the things that surprised you, from foreign trade zones to flags on ships, regulation, no regulation, tax havens, et cetera. I mean, like as you started to, untangle where the vessel had gone, how surprised were you at every turn of just like how this landscape works offshore?
Very. And the whole project started with this moment of surprise. Thinking about this barge just offshore across a gangplank from Lower Manhattan. This barge, the barge that I write about, spent many years of its existence off of the Lower East Side in Manhattan. And the reason that it came to New York was that this was really in the midst of the war on drugs. There was a huge surge in arrest rates in New York, which meant that there was huge overcrowding in New York City jails. Now, the way to alleviate overcrowding, one way would be to have fewer arrests, but the politics of law and order basically precluded that option. So how do you find more beds in the jail system? Ideally, if you're a city administrator, you would simply convert an existing building or build a new one. Building a new one takes a lot of time. Converting an existing building is a problem because you have to clear this very rigorous zoning review, what's called ULURP, the Uniform Land Use Review Procedure. And this can take months, if not years. And the New York City authorities are under court orders to find new beds for the system. So they have to act very fast. They have to act in a way that avoids this zoning law. They have to act in a way that allows them not to have to wait for construction. So what do? They turn to these barges that are foreign vessels, and by turning to foreign-owned vessels, they can circumvent the zoning regulations, circumvent even the fire codes that exist in New York. They are offshore, but they are just offshore. And you see this pattern repeating itself over and over again in the life of this barge. Of course, I was also really just surprised and taken with how 74-ish% of shipping by tonnage is registered in one of these flags of convenience where there is no genuine link between the country and the ship. And this is basically just for tax avoidance purposes or labor regulation avoidance purposes. Once you start looking for the offshore, you find it everywhere.
Just to stay on the barge for a second with the New York City story, right? It struck me in reading your book that the containerization of the shipping industry created a need for larger ports. So New York City suffered as a hub and shipping destination for centuries because the ports weren't big enough. So all of a sudden, a lot of people who worked longshoremen in New York City then lost their jobs. And then ironically enough, a container ship comes back, but not for shipping, but to house people who were in prison because they lost their jobs and got addicted to drugs and so on, right?
It's a great irony, a very cruel irony that, Manhattan was an incredibly vibrant port community, especially lower Manhattan. And it's not so much that New York, the greater New York metropolitan area, lost out because of the change in shipping. In the 70s, the Port of New York was the busiest, by some metrics, port in the world. It's just that that traffic went to a different part of New York Harbor. It went to the port of Newark or the port of Port Elizabeth across the Hudson in New Jersey. But for those people who were employed as longshoremen or in related trades, we're talking tens of thousands of people in lower Manhattan, those people suffered a really profound economic dislocation. And of course, that area suffered a very profound economic dislocation. And the adjustment to new industries and new sectors was quite difficult for really tens of thousands of people and very much contributed to this area being economically hollowed out for many years. So it's this cruel irony that containerization bypasses this area, and then X number of years later, really just 2 decades later, you get a container ship, but it's not to deliver goods, it's to house people, to accommodate people who have been imprisoned.
Unbelievable.
I want to point out that both our books are really about the offshore, right? His sort of more directly because you can see the ship, right? Mine's about putting things in a country that doesn't really have the same regulations for human rights, environmental rights, and so forth. So one of the linkages, though, is that I compare Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple at the end of the book, to Jack Welch, the former CEO, late CEO of General Electric. And you probably know this. He once said the ideal manufacturing facility would be on a barge, and it would just travel the world to jurisdictions where the laws were lax and allowed GE to build its stuff.
Yeah,
That's
amazing.
As we think about, you were alluding to the US government now getting involved in industrial policy, right? And it started during COVID in President Trump's first term. We need to reshore, stabilize supply chains. President Biden came in, Inflation Reduction Act, CHIPS Act, infrastructure bill, and now the president is, demanding companies reshore and bring factories back. When we think about the magnitude, and it just shocked me in your book, of the investment that Apple has made in China. When the CHIPS Act passed, that was a revolutionary bill for the United States. Talk a little bit about that investment that the US committed to vis-a-vis what Apple was already investing in China.
So the US committed to spending $52 billion over 4 years on the CHIPS Act. This is one of President Biden's signature plans. It's a plan to bring back chip fabrication, so making semiconductors to America. The Commerce Secretary at the time called it a once-in-a-generation investment. Apple is investing more than a CHIPS Act in China per year. So the figure is $55 billion per year. This is largely the training costs for the 3 million workers that they have in China, but it's also the extraordinary story of that Apple will purchase billions of dollars worth of machinery, but then of course there's no Apple factory to put it in, right? You can't find a factory with a bitten fruit on the outside. Not an Apple anyway. And so they purchase this machinery and then they put it in their suppliers' factories. And there's hundreds of factories across 4 major industrial clusters in China where Apple does this. And it's pretty stunning because what it allows the suppliers to do, especially 25 years ago, when China, made in China 25 years ago was synonymous with low quality. And Apple plays this role not just in training the employees and not just allowing suppliers to sort of move beyond their perceived capabilities, but indeed their actual capabilities because they don't have the money for the machinery, but Apple does. And so Apple installs the machinery. And so, of course, it's a story of, it sounds a little bit insane, but once you get the figures together, you realize Apple was responsible for like a nation-building effort in China because the investments are extraordinary. So $55 billion a year is what Apple tallied up themselves in 2015 as to how much they were investing in the country. And in 2016, just as Donald Trump was going on about the America First platform and telling his supporters to ban Apple, Tim Cook secretly went to Zhongnanhai in May 2016. This is the closest thing to the White House in Beijing, and pledged to multiply that figure for 5 years to invest $275 billion into China from 2016 to 2021. If you convert the Marshall Plan to 2015 dollars, Apple was pledging to invest twice the Marshall Plan in China.
And what China did was they created actual ecosystems. I think it's just really important to dive into that. It wasn't just factories. This was about labor. This was about supply chain, infrastructure. Talk a little bit about those ripple effects, because there's a line in the book, and I can't remember who said it. If it's a win-win, China wins twice.
Yes. So one thing I should say, I mean, I give China tremendous credit in the book for doing a lot, right? So Apple can, train the hell out of your engineers, but it's China that builds the 8-lane highways. It's China that builds the world-leading ports. It's China that builds the high-speed rail. So I know the argument, and sometimes I'm guilty of it myself, is that Apple built China, but of course they did this in partnership. They did this in tandem. Chinese industrial policy, 12-hour, 16-hour days among the Chinese workers coming from the hinterlands of China to live in cities temporarily, like Shenzhen. I mean, they played a tremendous role. But Apple really had the engineering talent. They didn't have the scale. I mean, I call the marriage of Apple and China the marriage of skill and scale. And what I worry about, getting ahead of myself a little bit, is China now has the scale and the skill. We never had the scale. We still don't have it. And I worry that we no longer have the skill either. So that's why it's a story not of not of Apple exploiting China, which is, I think, the standard narrative that we're probably all familiar with over the last 25 years. It's a story of China exploiting Apple because the technology transfer is on a gargantuan scale.
When we were together last night at the reception, you made an offhanded comment, which I thought was funny. Don't hate the player, hate the game, right? And it's one of these funny things. And I want to get your perspective on that, but also Ian's, right? Like the game of offshore shipping, like what exists, like what needs to change, and should it or shouldn't it, as we look into the future to create more equity from a human rights standpoint, to strengthen America and our own supply chain and infrastructure?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's a really hard one to answer because for the offshore world, whether it's moving financial assets offshore or it's the labor rights violations, this is not something that can be solved by a single state. It has to be done in tandem. And of course, international cooperation around the offshore has been very, very hard to effectuate since the get-go, certainly since the end of World War II. And what we see now is really a race to the bottom. Individual states can attract investment or can attract wealthy individuals or it can attract ship owners by offering lower standards, by offering lower tax bills. And there is very little under the current system for anyone to do about that. Now, some people have, including the sociologist Brooke Harrington, have suggested that really one way of confronting some of the issues of the offshore is to shame people or to shame companies that engage in some of the more dubious aspects of the offshore world, to bring more publicity and to really make that publicity have a moral edge. And I think that is one way of moving forward, certainly in the absence of sort of a real global geopolitical will to confront this as a globe.
Have I done that? Is that?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And please, like, you brought it up, but I mean, I feel like it just hits me in the head, and even to the point about skill and scale. Like, this is a live conversation. We're at the Washington Convention Center. The Capitol's one direction, the White House is the other.
Yeah.
This is a live topic. How should we be thinking about reskilling, reshoring, manufacturing? And I think even in the book or through our conversations, it's not only about China. It's about maybe not just building out at home in America, but allied countries supporting us. And
yeah, there's so much to unpack here. One thing I would say is sometimes we're so parochial with our with our laws. And so, for instance, like, it can be a major win if you're an environmentalist and you shut down, let's say, a mining operation in the US because it's toxic. But the thing is, the mining doesn't just go away. We still have the mining. It's just that it goes to a place like China that doesn't have the same regulation. And so I don't know if that's a win. I mean, I would certainly want to support, unionization of various factories, and I've been a part of a union in my journalism and so forth. But if you're supporting the unions and that makes things uncompetitive at a cost basis, well, companies choose not to invest in the unions, they'll just invest in a place that doesn't have them. I mean, one of the sort of heartbreaking accounts in the book is actually that Foxconn, the Taiwanese company that's sort of most associated with assembling Apple products, there was a time in the 2000s where it was building the candy-colored iMac, if you remember that, in the Czech Republic, in California, and in China. But what happens is that if you're Apple and you're comparing, you know, in Excel sheets or what have you, sort of the data and the working hours and everything else, the productivity, China just wins out over and over and over. And the Czech site in particular was subject to press scrutiny, you know, worker protests, and a host of things. And Foxconn was just able to get by certain laws. So for instance, if you were to have a mass firing, like if you as Foxconn got rid of more than 30 people in a month, you had to report it to the local labor office. And they had some 300 people working on Apple products at the time. So what did they do to not make waves? They fired 29 people a month until the entire team was gone, you know? No press scrutiny. I don't even know that it had really been mentioned, aside from some obscure academic article that I found for the article. So, for the book. So it's really tough to know. One thing I would say is it's too much to think that iPhone assembly, let's say, is going to come back to America. That's just not going to be a feasible thing, and there's so many ways that we can think about it. I would be a big advocate for it moving to Mexico, where you get lots of intermediary goods trade between Mexico and America, or India. I realize that maybe the best of all worlds is that it really does come back home, but I think that's unrealistic. I would take the win that if it's going to India or it's going to Mexico, we're at least de-risking from China a little bit. And I don't really have an issue with the US trading with China. I don't have an issue with Apple trading with China. It's the consolidation into one country that is so mind-boggling. For Apple, the most sophisticated supply chain company in the world, made the elementary mistake of putting all its eggs in one basket, and the basket turned out to be a surveillance state.
Just to stay on that topic though for a second, right? Like, could they even go to India or anywhere else, or just trying to hold all the cards, right? Like, we're seeing this massive commitment Tim Cook's making now to the president, $600 billion, et cetera.
Yeah.
Could they even, I mean, are they just too vulnerable to even?
Yeah, so
make any of these
the subtitle of the book is that Apple's been captured.
Yeah.
And there's probably a good half of the audience thinks, well, they are doing quite a bit in India. And they really aren't. If there are 1,000 steps in building an iPhone and the final step is now done in India, your phone will say made in India next year. That phone will be no less dependent on the China-centric supply chain than any other iPhone you've ever seen or held. I hope they make major investments in India to go through the whole depth and breadth of the supply chain and really do bulk up their operations. Very briefly, there's 3 big problems with that. One, Apple has a $70 billion business in China. The Chinese rightfully see the iPhone as an indigenous product. The more that Apple is seen as the poster child of de-risking from China, the more at risk their $70 billion business is. Beijing, since my reporting, has already classified infrastructure, machinery that's headed towards production lines for the iPhone in India, and just canceled them essentially. They're just not allowed to go. People that are Chinese that have the experiential know-how have had their visas revoked or they just haven't gotten them. China wants manufacturing know-how to be a one-way gate. The technology transfer comes in, it does not leave. And then the third thing is going back to what I said earlier. Yeah, sure, Apple can train the hell out of a bunch of Indian engineers and an Indian workforce and build the dorms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. India, unfortunately, isn't doing a good enough job of building the ports, building the 8-lane highways, building the high-speed rail, and so forth. And so, unfortunately, I really do think China was a once-in-a-century partner. That's probably understating it, and I don't know who's going to compete with that.
Yeah. Ian, when we were chatting, so much of the conversation circled around this invisible supply chain, this amorphous rules and laws. But even when we were prepping for today's conversation, it was all about physicality, about the physical nature of what we're talking about: ships, people, barges, infrastructure. Talk a little bit about that and how you unpacked it in Empty Vessel.
Right. Well, again, the initial impulse for this book started with something that was so inescapably physical. One of the former owners of the barge calls it like a big shoebox. Another, the technical classification is a dumb pontoon. And this is something that rusts, that has a very ancient vacuum toilet system that I won't talk more about. I mean, it's very, very physical. And one of the things that I realized as I was writing it is that so often the language and the way that we talk about globalization is abstract. Financialization, globalization itself, offshoring even. What does it really mean? It's easy to lose track of the fact that it depends on very, very physical objects and very, very physical roles. And it takes something like the Ever Given blocking the Suez Canal during the pandemic for people to really pay attention to physical infrastructure. And so one of the goals of this book was to tell these abstract transformations really through, by following a red thread of an intensely, inescapably concrete thing. And I think that's also something that is a nice overlap between both of our books, is thinking about the supply chains, the physicality of supply chains, the physicality of an iPhone. I think it's one of those things where once you start looking for it, it really is everywhere. And once you start, for me, talking to people who lived aboard this ship, whether they were prisoners or oil workers or soldiers, what they remember is the physicality. What they remember is the fire retardant, incredibly ugly curtains, the creaking as the ship went back and forth in the Falkland Islands, how the wind would rustle through. In England, when a part of the roof blew off down the jetty. I mean, these are the things that people really remember, the physicality of the offshore.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. As we think about what you were chatting about with Sweden having this investment, the Swedish government kept working on the shipyard, right? And then at some point they just had to stop. And then we look at China and they're making generational decade investments and not thinking about are they making money on it or not. What's the role of government in kind of either propping up, supporting, or investing in a longer term horizon?
Well, this is the tricky thing about democracies, is that in Sweden there was a ton of political pressure to keep up what were fundamentally unprofitable industries like shipbuilding. There was a tremendous amount of pressure for the government to support the Swedish shipbuilding industry, even as many buyers of large vessels were turning to places like South Korea that just had much cheaper labor forces and much lower wages and indeed much cheaper supply chains. Indeed, for every kroner that the Swedish government was throwing into shipbuilding, the Swedish economy was growing less than a kroner. And so it was a losing proposition, but one that ultimately took many years to turn around. And the vessel, I should say, is born in one of these nationalized Swedish shipyards that was supported basically because of these political imperatives.
There's a lot of talk here about shipbuilding in America again, right?
Absolutely.
Well, China has 200 times the shipbuilding capacity that America has, which is a mind-boggling statistic that you hope you misheard it or something. Yeah. There's so much to unpack there. I mean, I talked to a computer maker who, 25 years ago when they were making some investments in China, they looked at the per unit cost of building in Europe, America, and China. And it was a few dollars in America, a few dollars in China, in Europe, and negative $5 in China. In other words, for every computer they built, they were actually being paid by the state. How do we compete with that?
Free land, infrastructure,
Yeah, if you play your cards right in the Chinese political system, especially because, the biggest difference between Chinese communism and Soviet communism is that Chinese communism is really not top-down. You might think it's top-down, and certainly the 5-year plan is top-down, but how it's actually enacted is up to the local cadres. And they have intense competition, between Shenzhen and Hangzhou, or Hangzhou with Suzhou. And so the local cadres will do so much for you in terms of building the factories, getting you the world-class machinery, giving you access to land, giving you access to labor, et cetera. And so, this person's point was that the subsidies were so great that they were literally being paid to produce the computers. Well, you can understand if you're making that decision then, close the American factory, close the European factory, consolidate into China. And that's essentially what Apple did. I don't know how we compete with that, right? And there's something wildly ineffective about how China operates, but it's wildly inefficient, but wildly effective, something that sounds contradictory. I believe there are 80 different EV companies, electric vehicle companies in China right now. Probably only 5 of them will make it, but those 5 will have gone through a sort of evolutionary Darwinian struggle to become totally world leading, and we're already seeing that. BYD outsells Tesla and I think at least 1 out of every 2 EVs in the world is Chinese. Whereas we still talk about Solyndra, right? This failed company that the US government invested in like the Obama-Romney debates. This is a big deal. And like China has hundreds of Solyndras. And they don't have a democracy where people are complaining about it. So that's one thing. But we sort of need to have more of an openness to investment and failure, and a sort of net assessment of the whole game.
Which is hard because you just brought up Jack Welch, right?
Yeah.
And we have in this country shareholders and stocks and reporting and elections for Congress every 2 years and not thinking generationally.
Yeah, China can think famously long-term in a way that we can't. I don't know if it was Deng Xiaoping or it might have been Zhou Enlai who was asked about the 1976 protesters in France. Oh gosh, am I getting this wrong on live TV? Possibly.
No pressure.
And he said it was too long, it was too short. Oh gosh, I am just getting this wrong. Can we edit this? No. But anyway, China thinks famously long term, such that someone famously said something that it hadn't been long enough to tell, but they thought the question was about something that had happened 200 years ago rather than 4 years ago. I'm clearly butchering this.
But we get what you're saying.
But the point is made.
Yeah. What's unique about both of you is you're a journalist, you're a historian. And I want to spend a few minutes because there's a lot of aspiring authors out here. Let's talk a little bit about method, right? Like the Empty Vessel is like micro history. Talk a little bit about your process, your style for writing it, and then I want to hear from you, Patrick.
Yeah. This was, before this book, I had been writing very much in an academic style. I'd written another book about an economist that was geared really at academics. And this book was a little bit more experimental for me. It is also much more recent history. The thing that is wonderful about using the tools of history to write about the more recent past is that you're primed to look for archival materials, but then you're overwhelmed with the number of sources that are potentially available to you. So, for me, I had previously been writing about people who really are long since dead. And this time, you can just call people up and ask them. It's hard to overestimate how much time you spend in an archive thinking, I pretty much know the answer to this question, but I need to find that document that tells me, am I right? And this time, most of the people who are mentioned by name in this book are alive. And so you can just call them up. And this was during the height of the pandemic that I started working on this book. And I was at home in the kitchen, and everyone was at home in the kitchen, bored out of their minds. And so I can't imagine, the pandemic was an awful time. It was also an incredibly fertile time to call people up and say, hey, tell me about that barge you were on in the 80s. And people were delighted to talk about this. So the book draws from the sort of more traditional sources that academic historians use: government records, company records, legal cases, newspaper clippings, of course. But it also makes use of interviews, or what card-carrying historians might call oral histories. And so I just collected as much as I possibly could and tried to stitch all of those sources together.
And before Patrick goes, in a few minutes, we're going to open it up to audience questions, and there's 2 microphones here, so if folks want to slowly start lining up, we'll kind of make sure we save some time for folks to ask questions.
Okay, so Ian's largely talking about my statecraft, right? Which is just talking to people, and I spoke to more than 200 people with Apple experience for the book. But the biggest high I got, to sort of flip the table, is I came across more than 1,000 pages of internal documents at Apple that had been made public technically through court discovery, but no journalist had written on them or discovered them. And it was 15 months before the book was going to go on sale. And so it was just like, I hope no one finds this. And they didn't. And I spent something like 60 hours going through the material, and sometimes there was just so much that all I could do is search, and I would search for terms like highly confidential, and just go through all of those documents. We're talking about emails from Tim Cook to the board, a deposition of Tim Cook that lasts 3 hours, depositions of about 8 different executives, internal analysis of Huawei as a competitive threat, Apple's own acknowledgement that their products basically weren't living up to the standards that Huawei was then setting at a lower price. I mean, just remarkable stuff. So this is the sort of stuff that I think an academic or a journalist just absolutely dies for. And I was just, so enthralled by doing that. So really what makes the book is the interviews, but then to sort of substantiate it with all these internal documents was just, chef's kiss.
And as you guys both dove in, I mean, how surprised were you that so many of these stories were just never told? I mean, like, even reporting on Apple, right? You acknowledge it, right? Like the depth of the manufacturing, the ecosystem, like none of that has been told. I mean,
it really hasn't been. I realize it sounds like an overstated case because I think arguably Apple is the most covered corporation on the planet. I mean, find me another company where there's 6 to 12 blogs just devoted ostensibly to their daily coverage. Places like the New York Times literally have an Apple reporter, right? I mean, it's a global company, there are global reporters. And yet we've somehow all, and I'm indicting myself here in the 4 years as an FT reporter for Apple, really just missed the fact of how they make their products, right? How the sausage gets made is a really important part of the story. And if that's somehow not convincing, just consider that when Steve Jobs, probably the greatest product visionary of the last century, passes away, who becomes Apple's CEO? It's the guy who heads operations.
fascinating.
Well, in a certain way, I'm not too surprised that no one has written this story about this random barge. Apple, it is not. But one of the things, the offshore is receiving quite deservedly more and more attention, certainly among academic historians and journalists alike. And I think that what I felt was surprising, the lacuna that I felt was surprising, was, again, the physicality of how all of these processes fit together. Because the thing that was so lucky about finding this particular barge is just how many abstract processes touch upon its life. And I think that you can find 3 or 4 with lots of ships or lots of objects in the world, but to find 7 or 8, that's a lucky find. And I think it reveals something that is really worth considering. And we all sort of experience this in our day-to-day lives, that of course many different phenomena, many different transformations are affecting our day-to-day lives. But to really sit down and think about how they intersect, I think that was what was exciting to me.
And it's hard to imagine what you wrote in Apple in China without understanding containerization and shipping and these big investments and the kind of offshore benefits and deregulation and access to cheap labor and markets, right? So we're so excited that both of these books, and we could chat with both of you today. So grateful for you being here at the National Book Festival.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You were first.
Thank you, Ian and Patrick, for a conversation that was both fascinating and deeply dystopian. Wearing the optimistic hat for a minute, you were talking about human rights and loss of human rights offshore. Could you share some successes or wins in your respective areas on that front?
Do you have one?
It's a really tough question. It's a really tough question. I have to, because the tragic thing is that if you look at global shipping regulation right now, for one case that I talk about in the book is abandonment at sea, when global shipping companies will just abandon the crews of ships that they own because it no longer is profitable to keep paying them wages. And those have gone way up since the pandemic.
Wow.
There has been efforts by labor unions to address this. There is, I think, a much more tightly knit network of people who are engaged with one another globally. But in terms of the actual results, it's not a good story.
I'd go to the next question.
Okay, and just asking you super tight questions, and we'll try to get to everybody. Go ahead.
Fantastic. I was wondering, in terms of this globalization, and we see corporations and stuff moving away from America, how can we guarantee, or my question is, how can we guarantee companies moving back to the United States and back home and bringing jobs back home without lessening our human rights and workers' rights and workers' rights and all that stuff?
An equally troubling question, difficult question. Guarantee is the word that you used first. I certainly can't guarantee it, but we can create the right incentives. But it's really, really tricky. I mean, competing against China in manufacturing, where they have this Nietzschean will to power and just a whole system built up over about 5.5 decades at this point, is astonishingly difficult to compete with. I don't think we're going to do it alone. I could recommend a great essay in Foreign Affairs by Rush Doshi a couple months ago that talks about using our allies as a way to compete, because, to quote my own master's thesis from nearly a decade ago, the thing that America really has is allies and ideals. I mean, just think in terms of ideals, with the fact that one of our biggest problems is a border crisis. In other words, millions of people want to come in. That is not a problem in China. That is not a problem of Nazi Germany, right? Nazi Germany would build a wall to keep people out, or I guess the Soviets did. So there's something there that we can really affect. I mean, I think China's official allies are basically 3 different countries, and we have more than 100. So I'm really in favor of the Pax Americana idea of a network of commerce and trade, and not thinking that we can do it all alone. So it's kind of the opposite of America first.
Thank you for writing these books. This could be in the book. I haven't read it yet, but I will. What is this process that Apple's using? How is this different from other phone companies? And also, do you have an iPhone?
Yeah, great question. I do have an iPhone. I've had a lot of ethical quandaries about since publishing the book. So yeah, I should have taken off my Apple Watch maybe. Oh gosh, it's a difficult question. It's absolutely in the book. Apple sort of figures out how to have the level of control of manufacturing as if they do it themselves, despite not doing it themselves. I compare them to Uber, largest taxi network in the world. How many taxis do they own? 0. So they're really only after the high end. What people sort of confuse is they think Apple chases price. Apple chases quality. And really the story in the book is that to get the quality required in China, they send over plane loads of engineers to train, supervise, audit, handhold hundreds of manufacturers across the country. I mean, most people would be familiar with the number of industries that Apple has disrupted. I would just throw airlines into the mix, because in 2014 and in 2016, Apple convinced United Airlines to begin flying to 2 different cities in China they'd never been to, 3 times a week, nonstop from San Francisco, with the argument that we will buy so many first-class seats that if the rest of the plane is empty, you'll still make money. That's how many people were going to China.
So whenever a new product is either announced or, there's usually a 3-stage process. There's the announcement, and then there's the actual implementation, of an iPhone. But the things that aren't talked about is the third part of what happens when it's done. So do you have any insights on either Apple and China in terms of recycling, critical minerals, kind of how they're handling that?
I actually didn't really get into that for the book. So maybe the short answer is no.
But I think on that point, I think you're starting to see it even when you go to get a new iPhone, they buy back your old one. Right?
Yeah, oh yeah, the recycling program's a big deal at Apple, absolutely. But I don't have any particular insight, so I'll do my best not to have another live TV mess up.
So Patrick, we as Americans obviously take a great deal of pride in the free market and individual entrepreneurship. So I was really struck by that throwaway anecdote, I think, about the Chinese auto industry and how it's really this example of ruthless competition, even in a state that's, state-driven socialism for the most part. So in your eyes, and through the lessons that both of you have learned through your books, which countries are taking kind of the best lessons on how to enable those competitive capitalistic impulses through globalization, and what can we as the US learn from that?
It's another tough question. Yeah, I mean, I sort of have implicitly argued that China is better at capitalism than us, which is a great irony when you consider it's a communist country. What's really tough is Chinese industrial policy is world leading, but a number of the lessons are things that we can't accept and that we shouldn't accept. So among the things that they do really well is state-backed discrimination against a whole slew of rural citizens who are allowed to work in places like Shenzhen but are not allowed to actually live there. They can't educate their children there. They don't have access to retirement benefits or a host of things. I don't think we want to do that, and yet that floating workforce of more than 300 million people is what we're having to compete against. And if we don't compete against it somehow, then we're going to just have more and more manufacturing, rare earths mining and everything, all in a country that has very different visions for what Taiwan should be how the Uyghurs should be treated, a host of other issues.
Just to piggyback on that, Ian, did you get to see anything about competition on foreign trade zones and offshore benefits? Are other countries now trying to offer more of these benefits to either just become a recipient of tax havens and those dollars? Is this something that's just going to get worse?
If you take a look at the graph of the number of offshore trade zones or free trade zones, really starting in the late 70s when the story in Empty Vessel picks up, it is an exponential curve. More and more land, more and more virtual space is being carved out of existing sovereign territories as zones of exception. And certainly, countries are thinking about competing with one another in terms of what sort of benefits they can offer in these free trade zones. And so I think it's a real complication, a wrinkle in thinking about how big state policies, top-level state policy, economic or industrial or otherwise, when there are these very obvious and quite marketed loopholes to those policies. And those exist in the United States too. The system of foreign trade zones here are a system of loopholes and of exceptions that have been around since the 30s.
Yeah.
Awesome. Patrick, I'm a fellow U of T grad.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Go Canada.
Go Canada. Okay, so given that so much of Apple's manufacturing goes through China, how do we interpret singling out Huawei and TikTok as national security threats?
Such a sophisticated audience. These are tough questions.
I'm a tech policy professor at Duke. So.
Oh, right. Well, geez. Why don't I ask the question to you? That's a good question. I don't know. Huawei, what was the other one?
TikTok.
TikTok. These are sort of outside my expertise. I don't know. I've got emerging thoughts on these. I don't have conclusions per se. How about we have a U of T convention off to the side once it's over?
Come to Duke, give a talk there.
We'll talk. Yeah, we'll learn from each other.
Hi. So first of all, thank you. And a note to the audience, if you want to just skip 4 years of college and just get this for a global studies degree, that's what's going on right here. So it's clear that your books are covering a gap in literature, and this is publicizing the information that's in that gap. I'm curious what you anticipate the impact of that will be.
Yeah.
It's hard to say. I would love to hear what you think. I mean, this is again, a great move. You know, it's again. I think that this book participates in a larger shift toward paying attention to this offshore world, and I hope that this shift in attention, if it's large enough, gets states and NGOs and people to act in a way that closes some of these loopholes. Whether whether my book is like a little step, perhaps, in that direction, that would be wonderful. But I think that hopefully it also just makes people pay attention to the small things, to the small physical realities that are shaping the way that we go about our lives every day.
That's great. I'd love for the 5 people to get through, so go for it.
Yeah, curious about your thoughts about demographic shifts in China, declining fertility rates, aging populations, and obviously not an increase in immigration. And so is this a looming crisis for China?
I mean, yeah, I think, it's not, I don't think it's a novel take to say it is a looming crisis for China. They do face like a demographic time bomb. I believe the birth rate is under 1.0 births per woman in China right now. So that's a major problem. The question, in a sense, that I would try to tackle is that going to be a problem for Apple? And I'm not convinced it will be. So for starters, China installed more industrial robots in China last year than the rest of the world combined. So if there are ways to automate everything, China, unfortunately, is going to have a real leading edge in that respect. And secondly, as problematic as it might be for China writ large to fill the factory jobs, Apple has the wherewithal to do whatever is needed, whether that's paying extra, et cetera, using the lure of the brand image, et cetera, to have people in the factory. So what's a problem for China isn't necessarily a problem for the most iconic company in the world to be operating in China.
Good morning. Did Apple ever attempt to exercise influence within different factions of the CCP or choose like winners when you're talking provincial rivalries?
Oh yeah, there's a great, thank you for holding the book there. I don't know what page number.
Can you hold it like this?
So Apple does in fact have one joint venture in the country. This is something that they were sort of strenuously against for a long time. But China introduced new laws, I think in 2016, to house personal data of Chinese consumers within the country rather than that being someplace else. Not necessarily all that unique. The problem was Apple couldn't just build a data center to house that data, or rather it could, but only in conjunction with the state. So that's the first joint venture that they have. So they knew that they needed to build it somewhere, and what they did is they actually placed a bet on a very poor province called Guizhou. And the idea was they were trying to think in the second term of Xi Jinping who might be the successor to Xi Jinping. So they actually made a bet on this governor, Chen Miner, to basically like, if we make these massive investments, and Apple sort of is a magnet to draw in other industrial investments, then the province of Guizhou is going to look better and better and increase his chances of being the next leader of China. The chapter ends in some swear words where somebody at Apple recognizes that, oh, actually Xi Jinping is going to be a dictator for life. We made the wrong bet. We built those data centers in Guizhou for nothing.
Wow. Let's take these two questions simultaneously because we're about to run out of time.
Simultaneously?
So if you ask a question and you ask, and then we'll try to answer both.
Oh, I see.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wanted to get your spin on more of a trade-in value perspective on the Apple value chain. It's my understanding that what Foxconn captures is actually a very small percentage of the value. So why would we want to move assembly? And if we shifted our perspective to be more of a trade-in value added perspective instead of a traditional trade statistics perspective, would that change our perspective?
Great questions. Oh, sorry.
Go.
ahead. Really? Okay. Great question. So people have got this wrong for the last decade and a half. What they do is they take an iPhone, they sort of break it down, deconstruct it into all its constituent parts, and then attach little flags for where all the components are coming from. And if you do that, especially with the original iPhone, you don't see much contributions from China. And so people have concluded China actually just happens to be the last stop in a global supply chain, and it's actually making de minimis contributions. I really flip that on its head. The machinery and the processes behind the building of the iPhone are the contributions, not the components within. So that's one argument. The second thing is that as Apple has continued to consolidate in China, and as Beijing has sort of exerted more leverage against the company, more of the quote-unquote real estate within the iPhone is in fact more and more Chinese. So Foxconn is one contributor, but there are hundreds of factories, perhaps up to 1,600 factories in China contributing. And if in the aggregate, it's a massive investment.
My name is Kendra. I'm an Albanian student at American University.
I'm an Albanian student who went to American University too. It's amazing.
So I wanted to ask, since you mentioned earlier how China had put Apple had put its eggs in one basket. So I was wondering if China has been leveraging this position and maybe asking more demands of Apple, and if so, are there ways that China is trying to prevent Apple from outsourcing elsewhere?
Yes and yes would be the shortest answer. There's a bunch of details in the book, but I mean, to the extent that Apple has to sort of like use some political capital, it doesn't use it when Apple asks to ban the New York Times, to ban WhatsApp, to ban VPNs. Apple has acceded to all of those requests. There's a longer answer, but the short answer is yes.
Real fast, go for it.
I just wanted to ask how many products and what percentage of Apple products does China actually buy? Maybe Apple was looking at China as a huge market, and that's why it went there. Are they really buying Apple products?
Yes, that's definitely not why they went there. The story of how Apple became wildly successful in China is totally unforeseen by Apple, and it's my most fascinating part, my favorite part of the narrative. It involves organized crime networks. They're the ones in China who figure out that actually there's this huge demand-supply imbalance, and they sort of play against Apple, and it's a pretty fascinating narrative. The short answer is that gangsters end up getting more money per iPhone than Apple at the years in which Apple is becoming the world's most valuable company. So it wasn't some sort of like strategic vision on the part of Apple. They were really just there to build stuff because it was depressed labor and wages, and then they end up becoming really successful. So again, part 4, favorite part of the book.
Amazing. Ian Kumakawa, Patrick McGee. We'll talk after, yeah.
Thank you.